Everybody, welcome back. This is going to be our third video in Unit 5. Again, really long unit. We're trying to condense it as much as we can, hitting on the most important parts. So the third section here is going to deal with sustainable agriculture, and we're going to look at how we can make farming a little bit more sustainable. And when we talk about sustainability in agriculture, we're talking about soil conservation, where we're protecting the topsoil so it doesn't erode away, and we're protecting the nutrients within the topsoil. So when we look at these different conservation methods, we can utilize things like contour plowing, windbreaking. You can look at all these different ones and be able to read them. Hopefully you guys remember back to when we were talking about these in class. Contour plowing, again, that's where if you have a hillside that might run like this, instead of going up and down the hill, we're not going to plow like that because that's going to increase the soil erosion. It's going to provide paths for the water just to rush down the hill. So instead, when we plow, we would plow along the contours of the hill. That way it acts sort of like a slinky, if you will. The water speeds up, hits a row of crop, slows down, speeds up, hits a row of crop, slows down. And it keeps on speeding up and slowing down on the way down the hill. That way it prevents the water from reaching that top speed, and it prevents erosion as much as possible. The contour plowing is not going to do anything for the nutrients necessarily, but it's going to keep the topsoil in place, which in turn keeps the nutrients in place as well. But it's not going to add any nutrients to the soil. Windbreaks, those are like planting rows of trees along the side of a field. So if these are your field here, you can provide trees or a living hedge, like shrubs and things like that. That way, as the winds are blowing through the plains or through flatter land, it's going to hit that, slow the wind down, so it doesn't pick up those soil particles and blow them away and erode them out of the field. Again, methods to preserve topsoil. No-till agriculture is probably the best one that we could use, because now not only are we keeping that topsoil in place by having roots from the previous year still there, but we're also going to prevent carbon dioxide from getting in the sky. So with no-till agriculture, we leave the last year's crop residue behind. So if these are the stalks of, say, the hay or the corn plants, those root systems are going to stay in place to hold the topsoil from eroding away, either by water or by wind. What they'll do is they'll go through and mow those over, and a lot of times they'll actually bale them up and feed them to their animals as a source of food for them. But they mow those off, but they leave just the little stubs behind and the root systems in place. Not only does that help to prevent soil erosion, but as those rot away, they add nutrients back into the soil. The other thing it does, instead of turning that soil over and running a plow through it and flipping the soil over, we instead just drill down into the soil to put our seeds in for the following year. By doing that, as opposed to flipping the soil over, that CO2 that was sequestered in the soil and was going to be trapped there for extended periods of time, if you're plowing, that CO2 is going to escape up into the atmosphere. CO2, again, is a greenhouse gas. We want to minimize how much is going up there. So by drilling into the soil and just planting our seeds without plowing, that's minimizing the amount of carbon dioxide going up in the sky. It's also maximizing the amount of conservation that's happening as far as soil erosion prevention, and it's going to add nutrients in the form of green fertilizer. Perennial crops, again, they're pretty good too, because now they're going to grow year after year without replanting. I don't have to do anything to the field. I don't have to drive tractors over it. The plants just start to sprout up during the spring, and they grow on their own. Terracing, strip cropping, I think you guys can remember those. If not, Google those. But again, the goal of soil conservation is all about maintaining soil structure by preventing erosion and also maintaining the nutrient levels of the soil. So for the nutrient levels, we look at a couple different things. First one is we can rotate our crops. And rotating crops, we don't do this very much in industrialized agriculture anymore because we have the ability to use synthetic fertilizers. But in the farms that want to be sustainable and be 100%, I don't want to say environmentally friendly, that's a terrible word to use, but for lack of a better word right now, environmentally friendly, they're going to, on the AP exam, you'd always want to say what you mean by environmentally friendly. They're going to keep the soil from eroding. They're going to maintain the soil nutrient levels. So we use synthetic fertilizers on most of our agricultural industrial fields. But say that a farmer wanted to go and not use those chemicals that can run off and pollute the groundwater. They can utilize crop rotation. And again, that's where you're allowing the soil to recover after each successive planting. So you would set up your fields in kind of like 3 or 4 zones, and you would move each crop year after year to a different field. This is going to have a couple benefits to it. It's going to help the soil to recover from a nutrient standpoint, because now the soil has time to allow for decomposition to occur. Those biogeochemical cycles will occur, and we'll get those nutrients back to the appropriate levels. But it's also going to help to minimize pest damage, because the pests that we're feeding on, say, corn here, they're going to lay their eggs in the soil. They're going to start hatching then in the spring, expecting corn to be there. But we've moved corn over to a different field and replaced it with, say, soybeans. Now those pests hatch, they don't have their food source available, and then they start to die off. Green manure is another way that we can maintain soil fertility. And when you think about green manure, think about organic material. But it's not the manure like the poop that you think about. Green manure is just a general term for any organic material plowed into the soil or tilled into the soil. So if we are going to practice tilling agriculture, we want to make sure we're replacing those nutrients without using synthetics. So what they'll do is the crop residue that's left from the previous year, they'll actually till under the ground. That way it rots and decomposes, releasing the nutrients into the soil. One of the big problems with farming is we farm in area X, but then we take those that produce that we get from it and we ship it hundreds, thousands of miles away. So we're removing nutrients and moving them into a different area. So we can't just continually remove nutrients without replacing them. Eventually the soil is going to go away. Or not go away, but it's going to become nutrient depleted and nutrient deficient. So we need to find a way to add those nutrients back in. The first way we can do, a lot of the biomass of a plant is unedible or inedible. So the stalks and the actual stem of the plant, we don't eat those most of the time. We'll pick the corn off the stalk of the corn plant, but the corn plant really doesn't do anything for us. So instead of feeding it to animals, we can instead plow those stalks under, and by plowing them under, they're going to rot and decompose, releasing the nutrients that were trapped within the corn stalk. That removes less nutrients from the ground and reduces our dependence on synthetic fertilizers. The other thing we can do is adding limestone. And take a second, think back to why we would add limestone. Hopefully you guys came up with, if the soil pH is too low, it's too acidic, we can add the limestone buffer to help raise the pH to a tolerable level. Rotational grazing is another big one. If we're, an animal farmer, we don't want to graze the animals on this one field all over, for extended periods of time. They're going to end up overgrazing and destroy the vegetation. That's one of the tenets of the tragedy of the commons. So when we start to overgraze, the soil becomes nutrient depleted, plants don't grow. Anytime you don't have plants on a piece of land, erosion rates are going to be higher. So instead, just like crop rotation, we want to rotationally graze our animals as well. Let them eat a couple days in one field, move the cows to a different field. Let them eat there for a couple days and then move them around. By the time they get back to the original field, the grasses have had a chance to regrow and the animals have their food source again. So go ahead and test for learning. Take a second, pause, see if you can describe sustainable agriculture and food production practices, and describe 2 soil conservation practices that are designed to reduce soil erosion. You can go back, rewatch the video, see if you're correct, and move on from there. All right, so our next thing we want to address is our pest control. And we touched on it briefly when we talked about crop rotation. But when we look at pest control methods, most of the time, people just want to use pesticides. They're the easiest and most efficient. So they turn the pesticides, but the problem with pesticides is they're designed to kill. So even if we're doing precision application where we're only putting them on the pest, say that you have dandelions out in your yard and you're trying to kill the dandelion, you can apply the pesticide just to the dandelion, but that doesn't mean that when it rains, that excess pesticide you put on doesn't run off your yard and into the storm drain. After it goes into the storm drain, it dumps into the stream nearby. That then kills off all the life in the stream. So they're designed to kill, and they're not discriminatory in how they kill. They're looking for stuff to kill. And this is another important note when we're talking about pesticides and fertilizers. Always remember, pesticides kill, fertilizers help to grow. So if they're asking for problems associated with pesticides or benefits associated with pesticides, pesticides don't help the crops to grow. We increase our yields by having less pest damage by using pesticides. They're not helping the crop to grow at all. The crop is still growing the same as it always has. We're just not losing as much to pests. The other thing we can do is use genetically modified organisms. By using genetically modified organisms, we can incorporate basically natural pesticides into them. They did this with corn by allowing the corn to produce a bacteria that kills certain caterpillars that try to eat the corn. So we can do a lot of things with genetic modification. We can make them immune to pesticides, where we can apply pesticides over the entire field and not hurt the plants at all that we're trying to grow. So if it's a cornfield or a soybean field, we can spray pesticide to kill off all the weeds in the field and leave the soybeans or corn unaffected. We can genetically modify the plants to produce natural pesticides. That way they're not going to be eaten by the organisms as well. But there's benefits and drawbacks to each. Those were the benefits. The drawbacks are, again, pesticides can run off into bodies of water and cause dead zones to happen. With GMOs, what they're seeing is some of those traits can actually get passed on to other organisms through cross-pollination. So as you have, say, genetic resistance to a pesticide, if that plant cross-pollinates with a weed species nearby, and say it's a weed on the nearby side of the road, a bee happens to go on there and pollinate it. If that crosses and gives that genetic resistance to the weeds on the side of the road, now they can't kill those weeds off. They become super weeds. Those super weeds are able to spread uncontrolled, and basically there's no way to kill them. You can weed whack them, but they're just going to regrow. You can spray pesticide on them, but they're immune to it. So you can create these super strands of different pests that have a hard time being killed, and that really hurts our abilities to minimize the damage from those pests. Eventually, that resistance can get spread through other organisms. So I have to silence my phone here for a second. So pesticide resistance leads us right into that. Pesticide resistance is going to be when you apply a pesticide. This is not through genetic modification or anything else. This is a natural thing that occurs as we apply the pesticide. So it's very similar to antibiotic resistance. We're going to apply the pesticide. It's going to kill off most of the organisms. So let's say that we have, the blue ones are our regular pests, and the pink ones are going to be our resistant pests to the pesticide. Pink ones are in a very small amount. They may even get outcompeted if left alone for nutrients and things like that and go extinct. But when we apply pesticide, now it's going to kill off the ones that are not resistant. It's going to kill off most of those. We're not applying excess amounts of it, so we're not going to kill off everything, but we're going to kill off the majority. Then reproduction is going to happen. The blue ones are still going to reproduce. Then the pink ones are also going to reproduce. And you can see my relative proportion of resistant pest is increasing in here. So I reapply the pesticide and then allow for reproduction to occur. And you can see my, again, relative proportion of organisms is much more favored towards those pesticide resistance ones. So those pesticides aren't going to help and be effective for very long. There's going to be a natural immunity within the population, and that natural immunity is eventually going to become the dominant thing, and the pesticide will stop working. It's the same thing that happened with antibiotics. As we overprescribed antibiotics, we saw a graph that looked sort of like this. Bacteria or viruses, or pests started to grow exponentially. They were growing at their biotic potential. We applied the pesticide here, which caused the population to go down. But it didn't kill all of them off. It just brought it down much lower. They then start to grow at the biotic potential. We start to have damage done, so we reapply the pesticide again. Population starts to grow, and we see that, start to mimic this each time. When we look at this, the overall trend line, though, is an increasing pest population. more and more of them are becoming immune to the pesticide. So we're seeing more and more damage long-term from these. We are doing, short-term gains here where the crops are going to be thriving in those times. But overall, we're making the pest more resistant to that pesticide by applying the pesticides over and over. So we should be turning to alternative methods where we minimize the amount of pesticides we use and only use them as a last resort. That way we're not spreading things like that genetic resistance. And when we do that, we turn to a thing called integrated pest management. It's not a physical thing we can touch. It's a concept. So the goal of it is to minimize the pest damage. It's controlling the amount of pest damage you have to a tolerable level. Whether it's economically tolerable, whether it's behaviorally tolerable, where you can accept that amount of disruption from the pest, it doesn't matter. You're controlling the pest damage while minimizing disruption to the ecosystem. And we do this by using chemicals only as a last resort. So we use physical and biologic as much as we can. And you use all three of them together to minimize that pest damage. So physical could be things like physically pulling the weeds out or mowing the grass to a shorter height. You're doing something physical to limit that damage from the pest. If that doesn't bring it down to that tolerable level, we turn to our biologic controls, bringing predators in for the pest, providing pheromone traps to attract them into the traps. That way we can limit those. Providing habitat for predators. You don't have to necessarily introduce a predator, just make it so the predator is more likely to survive in that area. So if snakes are a predator for your pest, you're going to provide rock piles so more snakes are surviving in that area. Then if those two together don't bring it down to a tolerable level, now we use limited chemical methods. That's what integrated pest management is, and you want to make sure you know that concept. So these slides, again, they're just going to run through what the different processes are. I don't have to go through them. We just talked about them. You can read these ones and understand them better. Now, this one here is an important one, the endocrine disruptors. That's a concept you may see on the AP exam. Endocrine disruptors are things that affect the endocrine system, and that's what regulates our reproduction. So if we're altering the endocrine systems of the pests, we're going to influence their reproductive rates. It's basically like giving chemical contraceptives to the organism. So is it biologic or is it chemical? That's kind of up in the air a little bit. A lot of chemical synthetic pesticides act as endocrine disruptors, but you can also do that biologically, because what you can do is provide them food sources that have different chemicals in them to turn off those reproductive systems. Now, I would argue, though, they have endocrine system or endocrine disruptors in the biologic. It's affecting the biologic organism, but this is probably going to be a chemical method. You're going to use a pesticide. I'm sorry, I'm going blank here. You're going to use a pesticide that's going to act as an endocrine disruptor, which would basically be like a chemical contraceptive for the pest. And again, with chemicals, limited use at all costs, and we want the lowest dose that's the least harmful to the ecosystem. And again, you guys can read this. I think I'm going to pause the video here, stop. You guys can test for your understanding and see how you guys are doing. Again, go back through, Google. If you have questions on it, email me as well.